Sometimes I give a sermon, take off my jacket, loosen my tie. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens. Sometimes, and not often, people ask me, Rabbi, why do you do that? One reason I do it is because we're going to work for God. I'm about our Father's business. I'm not here as a white-collar rabbi or white-collar pastor. I've always said I'm more of a Peter than a Paul. So today, I want to reach deep down into your hearts and help you to try to change some of the things that you thought were impossible to change. I usually start out my message and end my message with Shabbat Shalom, so I'll say Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Today's message is about restoring relationships. You know, there isn't a person I know who doesn't have broken or damaged relationships in their lives. In Genesis 45, Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers, and he forgives them for the terrible things they did to him. And by following that example, the example of Joseph, we can learn how to restore our own relationships. There was a story is told about two brothers who were torn apart by a great distance. The two brothers, Shmulik and Yossi, and they were living in communist Russia and were attempting to emigrate to America. One day, Shmulik received permission to leave, but Yossi had to stay behind. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Mic's not working?
No.
Seems like it's working. So Yossi had to stay behind. And at their tearful goodbye, they were concerned how they would be able to communicate freely in spite of the fact that the Soviet government would undoubtedly be reading their mail. I have an idea, said Yossi. If I write you back, if I write you in black ink, it will be the truth. And if I use red ink, it will be false. Now Shmulik emigrated, and months passed. No word from Yossi. Finally, a letter arrived, all in black ink. It said, "My dear brother, life here in communist Russia is wonderful. We enjoy freedom and prosperity like never before. We have everything we could want. There are no food lines or shortages. We have a new TV and household appliances. In fact, the only thing we're lacking in all of Russia is red ink." You know, if you think your family has problems, consider the true story called the Marriage Mayhem, which was created when a 76-year-old named Bill Baker in London wed Edna Harvey. She happened to be his granddaughter's husband's mother. And that's where the confusion began. According to Baker's granddaughter, Lynn, she said, "My mother-in-law is now my step-grandmother. My grandfather is now my stepfather-in-law. My mom is my sister-in-law, and my brother is my nephew. But even crazier than that, I'm now married to my uncle, and my own children are my cousins." And from this experience, Lynn should gain profound insight into the theory of relativity. Unfortunately, most stories of messed up relationships aren't so funny. It's no laughing matter that half of all marriages among believers end in divorce. However, this message is not just about marriage or marital relationships, but all relationships. We're going to take a look today into an episode in the life of Joseph in order to learn the do's and the don'ts of restoring relationships. Now, learning and applying relational skills is vitally important because God made us to live in relationship with others. He made us that way. When Adam was alone in the garden, God saw that it was not good for him to be alone. You see, we can only live in relationships. We need each other. A rather crude and cruel experiment was carried out by Emperor Frederick, who ruled the Roman Empire in the 13th century. He wanted to know what man's original language was, Hebrew, Greek, or Latin. And he decided to isolate a few infants from the sound of the human voice. And he reasoned that they would eventually speak the natural tongue of mankind. Wet nurses who were sworn to absolute silence were obtained, and though it was difficult for them, they abided by the rule. The infants never heard a word, not a sound of a human voice. Within several months, they were all dead. Studies have shown that single men are jailed more often, earn less money, have more illnesses, and die at a younger age than married men. Dr. Bernie Siegel, Italian fellow, says that married men with cancer live 20% longer than single men with the same cancer. Women, who often have more close friendships than men, survive longer with the same cancers. Married or not, though, he says relationships keep us alive. Clearly, healthy relationships are vital to our very lives. They have statistics about people in hospitals who are in critical condition. They could live or die within hours. And even though they may not be believers, they may not have even considered whether or not there's a God, or maybe they just don't believe in the concept of God. And yet, when they are told, even patients in a coma, it's whispered into their ear that they're being prayed for, that God would heal them, they do better than people who are not prayed for. There's something there. Let's look together at the encounter between Joseph and his brothers, so we can learn the biblical principles of restoring relationships. The text of today's message is Genesis 45, verses 1 through 15. I'm going to give you 5 principles. Principle 1, don't make a public spectacle of the other person. That's right in Genesis 45, verse 1. Years before Joseph's jealous brothers sold him into slavery, Joseph's brothers had sold him into slavery in order to get rid of him. He lived as a slave in Egypt for years and was then thrown into prison on trumped-up charges. And after years of life in prison, he was set free because he was able, with God's help, to interpret a disturbing dream that Pharaoh had had. And he was placed in charge of all of Egypt and was second only to Pharaoh himself. And in his new position, Joseph prepared Egypt for the famine prophecy in the dream. And when the famine came, Joseph's brothers were forced to go to Egypt in search of food. And here we find ourselves in today's Parsha. Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And so he devised a little test to see if they would still sell out one of their own brothers. And they passed the test. And when Joseph decided to reveal his true identity and confront his brothers, he first cleared the room so that it could be done in private. Everyone get out of here. Only his brothers and he remained. There was a great deal of wisdom in that move. If someone has wronged you in some way, the last thing that you should do is broadcast that everywhere. Let me say right up front that there are some serious exceptions to that rule. For instance, in the case of rape or other violent abuse, the appropriate authorities need to be notified for your own well-being and for the safety of others. However, in most situations, You need to confront the individual or individuals in private. If you confront them publicly or go around telling everybody what they did to you, it will only make matters worse. I look to the Mishle, the Proverbs of King Solomon. In Proverbs 25, verses 9 through 10, it says this: debate your case with your neighbor, and don't betray the confidence of another, lest one who hears it put you to shame and your bad reputation never depart. Now, Morris Mandel said that gossip is the most deadly microbe. It has neither legs nor wings. It is composed entirely of tails, and most of them have stings. So the next time you're tempted to talk to someone, think T-H-I-N-K before you speak. T, is it true? H, is it helpful? I, is it inspiring? N, is it necessary? And K, is it kind? Think before you speak. If what you are about to say does not pass those tests, keep quiet. Principle number 2, don't bottle up your feelings. I guess Joseph didn't buy into the philosophy that real men don't cry. Because when he confronted his brothers, he wept openly and loudly. He didn't suppress or bottle up his feelings, but he let them out in a healthy manner. If our emotions are bottled up, they eventually blow up. God created us to be emotional people, and we shouldn't try to deny that. If you're trying to act one way while feeling another way, you are being emotionally dishonest. If we're going to restore relationships, we must start being emotionally honest with one another. How you doing today? Oh, I'm good. I'm great. How come you're standing over there blowing your nose crying? I'm good. It's the best day of my life. Or I love the people that ask you how you're doing and then they give you the answer because they're afraid you might start talking to them about your problems. So, how you doing? Good? Yeah, I guess so. Yes, yeah, I'm fine. We must be emotionally honest with one another if we're going to restore relationships. If we're going to be emotionally honest with one another, we must let our true feelings out. If someone did something that hurt you and made you upset, there's nothing wrong with telling them how it made you feel. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, Paul writes this: be angry, but don't sin. Don't let the sun go down before you have dealt with the cause of your anger. The Bible says that it is okay to be angry, but it's not okay to stay angry. How do we avoid staying angry? You ever hear people that hold grudges? How we avoid staying angry is by letting emotions out instead of bottling them up. We suppress, and then someone says, hey, how you doing? We bottled them up and they exploded. Sound like anybody you know? Proverbs 29:11 says this: a fool gives full vent to his temper, but a wise man holds it back. We can avoid giving full vent to our anger by letting out a little steam as necessary. A little at a time. You know, back in 1948, Betts and Thomas classified 45 Johns Hopkins medical students in 3 personality groups on the basis of psychological tests and questionnaire. The group that was prone to losing control of their emotions was labeled the Gammas. 30 years later, Betts and Thomas looked at, which was a big group at the time, Betts and Thomas looked at the health records of the former students. They found that 77.3% of the Gamma group suffered from major disorders, including cancer, high blood pressure, heart disease, and emotional disturbances. The incidence of disorders was only 25% among those who could control their emotions. The doctors repeated this study on another group of 127 male students in the classes of 1949 through 1964 with similar results. You see, controlling our emotions is literally a matter of life and death. An emotional blow-up will never make things better in a bad relationship. So we need to start being emotionally honest with each other, letting off a little steam at a time. Principle number 3, don't push away the other person. During this very emotional time, Joseph called his brothers to come close to him rather than pushing them away and not dealing with it because it was too painful of what they had done to him. He said, come close to me. Too often when people wrong us, we respond by pushing them away. Surely you can see that we will never restore a relationship with someone we are pushing away. If we're able to restore relationships, we must begin drawing close to those who have hurt us. I know that sounds backward. It sounds backward to me. But this is fact. If you look in the Bible, that's what happens. You get hurt by somebody, you need to get in touch with them. You need to meet with them. You need to talk with them, not push them out of your life. I will grant you that sometimes we need a break from the other person. Joseph spent years apart from his brothers before this day came. But if healing is going to take place, we must eventually come together, because restoration never occurs during separation. It's time to start shutting them out, and it's time to stop shutting them out and start letting them in. You know, I hear this popular phrase in the secular world, and unfortunately sometimes I hear it among believers. They're going to have a trial separation. What is that, a trial separation? But we're going to test it, see how we do living apart. Last time I checked, you were married, right? You know, under God, before the King of the universe, the one who gives you life and continues to see that you're breathing Him. We're going to have trial separation. We test it out. It doesn't work. We have to confront the problem. We have to deal with the problem. It's not going to heal itself. Principle number 4, comfort the other person. Do this. Comfort the other person. Joseph calmed his brothers' fears when they realized that this powerful and important man was really their brother. They also realized that he was in the perfect position to exact revenge. They were standing before the ruler of Egypt. Only Pharaoh was above him. On his word, you lived or died. He could have easily sent them all to their death. However, Joseph tells them that they do not need to be distressed. The greatest comfort that you can give to someone who has wronged you is forgiveness. Why should I want to comfort them when they hurt me? Because forgiving them heals you. William Ward said, forgiveness warms the heart and cools the sting. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 2 verse 7, you should rather forgive him and comfort him, lest by any means such a one should be swallowed up with his excessive sorrow. Another way that's translated is depression. Swallowed up with depression. Forgive the person. Carl Menninger, the famed psychiatrist, once said these words. He said, if I could convince the patients in psychiatric hospitals that their sins were all forgiven, 75% of them could walk out the next day. The art of forgiving is a spiritual gift that every believer should develop. Here are some practical suggestions for putting forgiveness into practice. Number 1, begin by assuring yourself that compared to Messiah's suffering, you haven't been seriously wronged at all. No matter what happens to you, you haven't been nailed to a wooden stake. Recall the many kind deeds that have been shown to you, perhaps even by the person who has harmed you. Sometimes we feel hurt by those who have shown us love or care, concern, even believers in the same congregation. Then we feel hurt by the person. We don't ever want to speak to them again. Yeah. But how many times did that person bring you a cup of coffee? How many of the times did that person think of you or invite you somewhere or whatever they did for you? And so one little thing and all of a sudden, goodbye, Charlie. My name's not Charlie, by the way. List the benefits. List the benefits you have received from God. You ever hear of count your blessings? List those benefits. Thank God for blessing you with His care and forgiveness every day. You're holding back forgiveness from them because they called you a name. You're holding back forgiveness for them because they insulted you by saying, "Why are you wearing that ugly tie today?" Jeez, where did you find that dress you're wearing on a sofa? Was that curtain somebody threw out? So they insult you one time and right away you don't want to talk to them. We have to thank God for His care and forgiveness, and we have to forgive. We have to also make an honest effort to pray for the one who has injured you. Those are Yeshua's own words. Pray for those who persecute you. Go even further by looking for an opportunity to help that person. Finally, before you fall asleep at night, repeat slowly and thoughtfully the phrase from the Avinu, the Lord's Prayer. It says, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." You see how Yeshua formed that prayer so it's conditional? You see that? It's not, "Lord, forgive us because you're the forgiving God." It's, "Father, forgive us our debts, our sins, as we forgive our debtors, those who have sinned against us." There's a condition. Yeshua spells it out plainly. He says, if you don't forgive those who are with you, you will not be forgiven in heaven. Principle number 5, serve the other person. Joseph was in the perfect position to make his brothers pay for everything that they had done to him, but he decides to do just the opposite, to serve them, to help them. He declares his intention to serve their needs brought on by the famine. And in Galatians chapter 5, verse 13, it says, serve one another in love. It doesn't say when you're all happy about each other. At any time, serve one another. Can you do me a favor, take a cup of coffee to so-and-so? I'm not taking a cup of coffee to that person. That's how me confuse somebody else. Serve one another in love. In 1972, NASA launched the exploratory space probe called Pioneer 10. I don't know how many of you remember it. According to Leon Jaref in Time magazine, the satellite's primary mission was to reach Jupiter, photograph the planet and its moons, and beam data to Earth from Jupiter's magnetic field, radiation belts, and atmosphere. Now, scientists regarded this as a bold plan, for at that time, no Earth satellite had ever gone beyond Mars. And they feared that the asteroid belt would destroy the satellite before it could reach its target. But Pioneer 10 accomplished its mission and much more. Swinging past the giant planet in November of 1973, Jupiter's immense gravity hurled Pioneer 10 at a higher rate of speed toward the edge of the solar system. At 1 billion miles from the sun, Pioneer 10 passed Saturn. At some 3 billion miles, it hurled past Neptune and Pluto at almost 4 billion miles. By 1997, 25 years after its launch, Pioneer 10 was more than 6 billion miles from the sun. And despite the immense distance, Pioneer 10 continued to beam back radio signals to scientists on Earth. What's special about that? I'm going to tell you. This is directly quoted from Time magazine. Perhaps most remarkable, writes Jaref, those signals emanate from an 8-watt transmitter, which radiates about as much power as a bedroom nightlight and takes more than 9 hours to reach Earth. This was, Pioneer 10 was the little satellite that could. And the little satellite that could was not qualified to do what it did. Engineers designed Pioneer 10 with a useful life of just 3 years. But it kept going and going and going. By simple longevity, its tiny 8-watt transmitter radio accomplished more than anyone thought possible. And so it is when we commit ourselves to serving the needs of those who harmed us in the strength God provides. God can work even through someone with only 8-watt abilities.
Amen.
1 Peter chapter 4 verse 11 says, "Whoever serves, let it be with the strength that God supplies. So in all things may God be glorified through Messiah Yeshua." When you're tempted, and I know we are, I am. When you're tempted to think that you don't have the power to help those who harmed you, I just can't bring myself to talk to that person. I just can't. Remember that God is your source of strength. He's the one that empowers you.
Amen.
In conclusion, we see that restoration results in celebration. In verse 14, we see that Joseph and his brothers threw their arms around one another and kissed one another. It reminds me of the celebration that took place when the prodigal son was restored to his father, and the celebration that takes place in heaven every time a wrongdoer is restored to a right relationship with God. You see, it's a biblical principle that restoration results in celebration. It is that celebration that makes the hard work of restoration worthwhile.
It's the cable.
Yeah, it's working. I'm holding it this way. I'm not touching this thing. We need a new mic and cable. Banging it seemed to work. One day, an angry man rushed through Rijksmuseum, R-I-J-K-S, pronounced Rijks, in Amsterdam, until he reached Rembrandt's famous painting called Night Watch. And then he took out a knife and he slashed it repeatedly before he stopped. A short time later, a distraught, hostile man slipped into St. Peter's Basilica in Rome with a hammer and began to smash Michelangelo's beautiful sculpture, the Pietà. 2 cherished works of art were severely damaged. But what did the officials do? Throw out the artworks and forget about them? Absolutely not. Using the best experts who worked with the utmost care and precision, they made every effort to restore those treasures. Surely, our relationships are more worthy of restoration than mere pieces of art. Bear with me a couple of minutes more. I'm working towards my ending. J. Stuart Holden tells of an old Scottish mansion close to where he had his little summer home. And the walls of one room were filled with sketches made by distinguished artists. And the practice began after a pitcher of soda water was accidentally spilled on freshly decorated wall and left an unsightly stain. At the time, a noted artist, Lord Landseer, was a guest in that house. And one day, when the family went out to the moors, he stayed behind. And with a few masterful strokes of a piece of charcoal, that ugly spot became the outline of a beautiful waterfall bordered by trees and wildlife. And he turned that disfigured wall into one of his most successful depictions of life in the Scottish Highlands. Verse 16 of our text today tells us that Pharaoh was pleased to learn that Joseph and his brothers had restored their relationship. Pharaoh was pleased. When he heard that that relationship was restored, Pharaoh, who was not even part of that family, was very pleased to hear this news. You see, no relationship is beyond the restoring power of God Almighty. Let me close in prayer. Our Father in heaven, as we work toward restoring relationships, may a watching world learn of your great power of forgiveness and restoration. And in Yeshua's name we say, Amen. Shabbat Shalom.